The good news is the IRS is reporting a 10% increase in the size of the average taxpayer refund and how more taxpayers are getting it. However, initial data also shows Americans are not spending the windfall. Instead, understandably, they're either saving the money or using the proceeds to pay down debt. Now, both of those things are positive in their own right, helping struggling Americans after years of forgot how to grow in flat beverage. But from the broader economic perspective, this is not what people were hoping for. It is what should have been expected, though, particularly in the context of basic economics, small e economics, not the stuff that's preached by PhD, capital economists who tout the macroeconomic benefits from government stimulus. We've seen this before in 2008 as well as 2001 with very similar results. Repeated experience shows that when people are under stress, they behave rationally, even prudently. In that sense, the lack of spending is just another sign of the tremendous strain that everybody's under. And even while the refunds are ramping up in January and February this year, the Federal Reserve's consumer credit data had already indicated growing caution, well before the Iran conflict and energy shock. The aggregate revolving credit balance across the banking system was flat. And since these credit estimates correspond very clearly with jobs data, including the payroll numbers, at least after they had been revised to better reflect the length and the depth of the ongoing flat beverage employment weakness, that was an early warning about how Americans would respond, or in this case, not respond as had been hoped. After all, with the jobs market and therefore incomes contracting in the second half of last year, and again to start this year, workers, consumers, they've already been falling further and further behind. Toss in the $4 price of gasoline, and what happens is what everybody should have expected to happen. Americans use the money, the tax refunds that they're getting, that's a positive, but they're using the refunds not to spend, but to pay down debt and to save for the future. And where it does get spent, unfortunately, it's being spent on that $4 gasoline. So again, the good news is that tax cuts are producing more refunds. More money in the hands of taxpayers is always a positive. But as far as macroeconomic stimulus, the results are always underwhelming whenever the economy is facing substantial headwinds. When it's on a downturn, it's the downturn that matters, not the stimulus. Now, we know that's been the case the last couple of years because, for one thing, American consumers have been telling us that nonstop. Consumer sentiment has deteriorated sharply across every survey, not just the most extreme ones like the University of Michigan's. It goes back to 2024 when employment really started to drop off and flat beverage began to show up. Lack of jobs, lack of incomes, higher cost of living forced on the world years ago. People outside the top income tiers, they've been falling further and further behind. Their debts become a bigger burden, which is, in fact, the primary reason why we got to know the cockroaches, for example, like Tricolor. It was stressed subprime households who just couldn't take flagging incomes and the lack of jobs any longer. Many started to buckle, and when they did, it started to pull back the curtain on the insanity and garbage in private credit. But from the start, tax refunds, okay, good idea for individuals. Just don't expect it to produce a broad or positive effect on spending. Remember, that's what economists, the capital E variety, constantly claim. You give people money, they spend it, which leads to more revenue for businesses, which then hire more workers who now have more income so they can spend more, and so on, into the theoretical virtuous circle of Keynesianism. But if stressed workers don't spend their tax refunds, the circle doesn't get closed and the economy doesn't pick up, even if the government is throwing around the big bucks to do so. As we'll see in a minute, that's exactly what happened the last couple of times this was tried under these similar circumstances. Paying down debt, saving money, at best, in this case, spending on higher gasoline, but little else. And that's what the initial data here in 2026 is already showing. In a world where markets swing on every headline, focus matters. That's why Eurodollar University offers its one big weekly theme, a disciplined thematic analysis that you can count on. If you don't have time to go all the way to the depth of Eurodollar University's comprehensive deep dive analysis, but you want to get the next best thing, one big weekly theme is for you. Each week, we pick the one high-impact macro and market theme, and we unpack it from first principles, from fundamentals to real-world implications, so you can see the forest and the trees, drawing from all over the vast Eurodollar University library and canon. What you get with one big weekly theme is a single focused theme each week, unpacked with clarity from sources you will not see anywhere else. Data-driven analysis supported by charts and information pulled from Eurodollar University's other subscriptions and offerings, all in a simple, repeatable framework you'll use week after week. We distill the complexity into a practical, fundamentals-first playbook that you can rely on. This is not about chasing every hot idea. It's about building a disciplined routine that sharpens your judgment during these periods of uncertainty. So if you're ready to make your week count, subscribe to One Big Weekly Theme today. Visit eurodollaruniversity.substack.com or click the link in the description to learn more. You can sample the service or sign up and get started straight away. Eurodollar University, a focused approach to mastering money and macro, one thoughtful week at a time. Quote, federal refunds are averaging about $3,500 this year, according to the Internal Revenue Service data through early April. That's up roughly $350 or about 10% from last spring, thanks to tax changes in President Donald Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Many households are using the extra cash to shore up their finances rather than splurge. At a time of, they say, stubborn inflation, it's really lack of income, and soaring gas prices from the Iran war, they're focused on getting their own fiscal homes in order. Early tax filers increased their debt payments by about 20% in the 3 weeks after receiving refunds. 20% increase in debt repayments, according to David Tinsley, the senior economist at the Bank of America Institute. That includes paying down student loans, that's a big one, as well as car and credit card balances. And lower income households, those who are pinched the most by the affordability crisis, again, lack of income, they're just different terms for lack of income, have put even more of their refunds, nearly 30%, into repaying debts. They're also using the refunds to catch up on other bills. Some are maybe buying clothes, phones, and other personal items for themselves or their families, but only after taking care of necessities. As Tinsley himself says, they're not just rushing out and blowing these refunds, they're also repairing their balance sheets. That last little bit was already on display in February, before we got to the energy shock, the Iran conflict, and $4 gasoline. Americans had already been paying down, or at least not taking out as many credit cards and credit card balances as they had been. Revolving consumer credit, according to the Federal Reserve, has been getting weaker and weaker and weaker, in the same manner as the job market. Unlike installment loans for cars or appliances, which are more related to changes in interests, credit card use tends to correlate with employment. Whenever card owners are secure in their jobs and confident about their incomes and opportunities for better income, they'll naturally run up their revolving debts. However, once they begin to sense labor market softness, consumers begin to rethink their usage. And should that softness become, flat beverage, they'll put their cards away entirely. And the further down the flat part of the beverage curve we go, the more likely borrowers actually pay down their outstanding balances rather than take on any additional ones. Consumers cut back on their cards while also taking out fewer new ones. The aggregate revolving credit balance slows to a crawl and then can even reverse the more jobs that get lost. Now, what the Fed data showed for February was a minuscule increase in the seasonally adjusted balance. January wasn't all that much either, and while December was something of a splurge, that happens every now and again, card usage has been clearly slowing down for some time. Like I said in the intro, that corresponds strongly with the establishment survey data because of course it does. It's basic economics. So that already indicated how taxpayers, especially at the bottom ends of the income spectrum, were likely to be using their refunds once they got them. They were paying down credit cards before the refunds. They're not going to stop now with them. Because the labor market is anything other than strong or solid, the propensity to pay down debt is far higher than it would be under better, actually resilient employment conditions. Consumers themselves, they've said they're afraid on jobs and income. They've been saying this more strenuously for many, many months now, for well over a year. So the credit data showed they were already behaving that way. Tax refunds are just following along the basic economics of reality. Now, bumping up tax refunds, nothing new. Governments have been using their tax policies, largely tax cuts, as stimulus forever, at least during this Keynesian age. The results, never good. Same thing as with, the Federal Reserve and its rate cuts and the other programs that they label stimulus as well. At best, what you get is economists standing there scratching their head after it's over with and they don't get the results that they promised, instead saying, well, it probably would have been worse if we did nothing. So they end up arguing over how many theoretical jobs they saved rather than any straightforward results which showed the policy worked as it was intended. Remember, giving taxpayers more of their money, they're supposed to spend it, leading to the virtuous circle. Spending leads to higher employment, which creates more income, therefore more spending, and so on. Now, it's a questionable proposition, even in the best of times, because research has long showed people respond very differently to windfalls than they do regular income. Milton Friedman called it the permanent income hypothesis, and it doesn't really need a fancy name. Again, this is just common sense, basic small e economics. So if you find $350 sitting on the side of the road, you don't go out and buy a new car or lock yourself into that kind of payment. Maybe you spend some of it, but based on macro conditions, time and again, history shows you're far more likely to pay off the bills you owe or pay down debt. Now, the twin Bush experiments provide useful examples. Now, people forget these happened because that's how effective they were. They were forgettable. No virtuous circles. Just more government debt because good Dr. Keynes, he demanded governments borrow to get the economy rolling toward that circle, and it never really happens. If you don't remember early 2008, the Bush administration's genius plan was to pay off taxpayers with tax credits, basically what most people imagine as helicopter money. The Economic Stimulus Act of 2008 was passed on February 13th, and 2/3 of that $150 billion that was allocated for it, which was an enormous amount for the time. It seems like a drop in the bucket these days, but that was enormous in early 2008. About $100 billion of it was these credits, literal checks that were mailed directly to taxpayers. Roughly 130 million households received them, individuals. They got between $300 and $600, while joint filers ended up with between $600 and $1,200. So somewhat comparable to what we're getting here in 2026. And what the research shows is that the majority of recipients, they paid down their debt, they paid off their bills, and just saved what was left over. And remember, this wasn't late 2008. This was well before Lehman Brothers. The economy was in recession in effect, but most people didn't know it. The labor market was increasingly rough, and that's what they were responding to, not the headlines, which continue to be positive, especially anything that was said by any central banker anywhere. The mainstream said 2008, early 2008 anyway, was just a little hiccup, and that the government payments on top of the Fed's ridiculous rate cuts would ensure the economy wouldn't get any worse. It was supposed to be a combination of fiscal, monetary, it's not monetary, but fiscal and Federal Reserve stimulus. Now, one of the most widely cited studies on the matter, the fiscal part of it, which published in 2009, reported, quote, only 1/5 of survey respondents said the 2008 tax rebates would lead them to mostly increased spending. Most respondents said they would either mostly save the rebate or mostly use it to pay off debt. The most common plan for the rebate was debt repayment. The survey estimates imply that the marginal propensity to spend from the rebate was about 1/3, and that there would not be substantially more spending as a lagged effect of the rebates. And that's part of the Keynesianism too. Spending leads to more spending, which leads to more spending. That didn't happen. And because of the low spending propensity, the rebates in 2008 provided low, quote, bang for the buck as economic stimulus. Let me read that again. Because of the low spending propensity, the rebates in 2008 provided low bang for the buck as economic stimulus. Putting cash into the hands of consumers who use it to save or pay off debt boosts their well-being, and that's not nothing, but it does not necessarily make them spend. In particular, low-income individuals were particularly likely to use the rebate to pay off debt. And we're seeing exactly the same things here in 2026. Now, this didn't mean, and it won't mean, there was no spending or won't be spending, nor any impact on the economy. There was some, just as the authors also write in the study, just a lot less bang for the buck. GDP in the second quarter of 2008, for example, it turned positive after an ugly start to the year. But it didn't make any difference. It didn't stimulate a turnaround. Uncle Sam went deeper into debt so that individual taxpayers could pay off some of their credit card bills. You can see this in the savings rate for 2008. It jumped from 2.4% in April to 6.8% the next month in May as the checks were being mailed and processed. But after that, the savings rate dropped back toward 3% again, not because taxpayers began to spend, but because what they feared would happen started to happen. Incomes dropped even more as job losses picked up more and flatter beverage. Now, the same study that I just quoted Also, look back at the 2001 experience because apparently George Bush loved doing this mailing checks and direct payment stuff. And guess what? Very similar results. Most people back then saved or paid down their debts. Very small proclivity to spend. The savings rate also spiked during the summer of 2001 when the stimulus checks were being sent out. But because the 2001's dot-com recession was mild, many economists thought these payments, along with Alan Greenspan's aggressive rate cuts, they thought that the combination of central bank policy and fiscal policy had worked. They hadn't stopped the recession, of course. They didn't stop the job losses, but maybe, they claim, it would have been worse had authorities done nothing. There was some jobs that were saved, a counterfactual that no one can ever disprove, which is kind of the point. The stimulus didn't stimulate, so they just say it did and claim that we know it must have because it didn't get as bad as 1929. Economics really is not a serious discipline. It's an ideology masquerading as a science. And the counterpoint to this is, of course, 2020 and 2021. Bigger helicopter payments, what seemed to be a much more direct and obvious effect, certainly in consumer prices, right? First Trump twice, and then Biden sent out even larger payments, this time digitally dropped right on into everybody's bank accounts just to make it convenient. Now, spending did respond, but the evidence shows it wasn't any more proportionally than 2001 or 2008. People still paid down debts and saved. It appeared to have a bigger impact. It appeared to have a bigger impact, certainly on prices, because of the unique circumstances of the time. The lockdowns, the restraints, an economy that was coming back off the lows. It was already on its way up, not falling further down as in 2001 and 2008. Plus, the price impact of what everybody calls inflation was mainly about the supply restrictions more than the spending impact of government payments. I mean, just look at the savings rate. It shot up to a ridiculous 30% in April 2020, partly because there was no spending or anything happening at all, but it was still double digits heading into 2021 before the third helicopter from Biden pushed it right back up to 26% all over again. Either way, the more important variable is the state of the labor market. It was on its way back up 5 years ago, even if it wouldn't get all the way there. Meanwhile, in 2001 and 2008, consumers were responding to employment, which was moving further down the flat part of the beverage curve rather than climbing out of it. And that's where we are in 2026, going further flat. So no surprise the tax refund stimulus is not stimulating as it had been hoped. The Keynesians are Keynesian themselves all over again. Remember, the primary purpose here, according to economists, is to get everything moving, to use the government as the only game in town to restart everything, or what Keynes himself called pump priming. You throw some money at the economy, it leads to activity that then generates more activity, and pretty soon you know it, the whole thing is moving the virtuous circle. That's just never how it works. When the system is slowing down and experiencing a downturn, stimulus does not stop the downturn. The government injections don't turn it around. At best, they have to claim that after it fails, maybe it kept the downturn from being worse than it otherwise would have gotten to be without the stimulus that didn't stimulate. Just look at China. By all accounts, the current economy and labor market remains firmly in a downturn. I mean, the establishment survey shows it. The income data does too. We went over revolving credit, jolts, and the ugly jolts in hiring, negative turnover there, consumer sentiment across all the consumer surveys. In other words, an entire array of different kinds of evidence put together by a variety of different sources. And all of it says downturn. Now, much of it points to a modest contraction already, and one that was not provoked by tariffs or tariff uncertainty. It's much deeper than that. And all the data shows it goes back much farther. This thing has been slowly grinding downward since early to mid 2024. In fact, the whole point behind the tax cuts and refunds here in 2026 is the Trump administration figuring out the economy really was in bad shape last year, and it actually had been getting worse. Just look at the establishment survey. 0 job growth for an entire year in 2025. It really doesn't get much worse than that, except for the kinds of recession that the NBER will even admit is a recession. The tax cuts were intended to be stimulus to try to solve that problem, but it should be no surprise that the results that we're already getting are nearly identical to the past rounds of stimulus, which also did not stimulate. And that's before we even consider the effect of higher gasoline and the full weight of the energy shock. So on individual merits, yes, we should always be looking to cut taxes, always. Now, it would be much better if lower taxes were paired with significantly lower spending, but that's just not the world that we live in. It's also a big positive for individuals, especially households, because let's face it, they need more help, especially since the economy sucks, and it has sucked for years. Jobs are disappearing. Incomes are not growing. In fact, they're shrinking in relative terms. But as far as stimulating the economy via spending, it's not happening. Yes, there's going to be some additional money spent in the short run, but it'll be nowhere near enough to change the trajectory of the economy. Instead, the fact that taxpayers aren't responding except in the same way they always do under these circumstances just further proves these circumstances. You save money and pay down debt when you're worried about jobs and incomes, and right now, people are saving money and paying down debt because there's every reason for them to be worried. Flat beverage rules the game, not government checks. And then when you start to add the energy shock on top of all that, it really starts to get to what the IMF said was drifting closer to their adverse scenario. All the details in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.